This is Living in Color, a series about POCs, which stands for People of Color, that looks at how our everyday experiences are shaped by the color of our skin. In this episode, we take a look at the experiences POCs face in the LGBTQ2S community. Welcome to Living in Color. I'm your host, Farah Nasser, and this week I'm joined by Yasmin Prasad, Iris Robin, Kylie May, and Joel Sitahal. LGBTQS. One of you described it to me as alphabet soup. There's a lot of letters there, but each of these terms is important. And before we start our discussion, I want to tell you all that I'm going to try my best to use the right terms, the right pronouns. But if I do make a mistake, please jump in, please correct me, because that's what this show is about. So we're going to start with you, Iris. You are non-binary, genderqueer. What does that mean?
I would say for me, it means that I don't identify as exclusively male or exclusively female all the time. It's a little bit complicated because gender, as we understand it, it has a lot to do with roles and how other people perceive you.
And you're a model, so that means you can dress like a man, dress like a woman.
Ideally, it would be I would just dress how I want to without other people associating it with masculinity or femininity necessarily.
See, I just did that, so that's interesting to know. Right, okay. Let's go over to you, Kylie. I want to ask you about Two-Spirit. What does that mean?
Well, there are many different understandings and explanations of what Two-Spirit means according to, it varies from nation to nation. So there are many different indigenous nations, and each nation will have their own teachings and understanding, and each Two-Spirit person will have their own experience of what it means. But basically, Two-Spirit means being at the intersection of being indigenous and LGBTQ. Sometimes that is connected to the traditional culture and spirituality. But it is important to note that not everybody who is LGBTQ and Indigenous identifies as Two-Spirit.
So you identify as trans and Two-Spirit, yes. And my understanding was Two-Spirit is, you know, you're almost more evolved because you see further in the male direction and in the female direction. Is that what it is?
Well, the word Two-Spirit comes from the understanding that a person who identifies this way does carry both of like the masculine and feminine energy, or all of the energies. So I do embrace that part, and it is tied to, in a sense, being trans or being gender fluid, although those words did not exist hundreds of years ago. But it is a contemporary term.
Joel, I'm going to go to you next. You identify as bisexual, but you didn't always identify that way. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, even bisexual, I just kind of say that as like an umbrella term. I'd even say pan, maybe. It's almost the equivalent of what I was saying about gender fluidity. It's like kind of like you're not bound to just being sexually attracted to male or female, but you're just open to like literally anyone on the spectrum, anyone in between. So non-binary people as well. But
you originally identified as a gay man.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, obviously a lot of ideals are shown to us, and in Hollywood especially, ideals of heteronormative relationships. And moving out of university is when I kind of branched out on my own, stopped listening to the voices of everyone else, kind of put myself in the world and just realized like, I just love people.
Yasmin, you identify as a trans woman of color, and you've spoken about why it's important not to be misgendered. Tell us about that.
Well, often, you know, misgendering comes from appearance base. So many people, what they see physical, they assume that's the gender that person might identify as. So often we have to not look at someone and assume the gender that we're seeing is the perceived gender. And often the best way is to ask. So introduce yourself, introduce your pronoun, and then ask someone what pronoun or gender they might identify.
So give me an example of that, because I'm very curious. I think we live in a world now where we're so worried about offending people, right? And that's kind of the purpose of the show, because we should talk about these things. And I love that you said that. So how would that conversation go?
So you and I might meet for the first time.
Okay.
And then I'd say, hi, my name is Yasmin. My pronouns are she and her. And then you will kind of click in and be like, hi, I'm Farah.
Okay, and my pronouns are she and her. Okay, I get it. So that's how, and it's okay to ask?
Of course it is.
What pronoun?
Yes. So then someone knows where you're coming from, because the worst thing is to misgender someone.
Right.
It feels like really,
so you all agree with that?
Yeah, it's better to ask than to assume.
Okay,
yes.
Okay, I like that. Let's talk about labels, and I'd love for you all to jump in on this discussion. What is wrong with labels? What's wrong with labeling someone something?
Well, I don't think it's wrong with labeling someone. It's how and what the label is used as. Because in different spaces, different contexts, for me, I need certain labels to navigate my life, to navigate the work that I do. So in certain, like today, we're talking about trans women of color,
Right.
the experience of racism, all the intersecting identities. So in that way, I would take on those labels. But maybe outside of here, I don't want to, people looking at me in one particular way.
Because you
the
might
other.
identify with more than one thing, Iris.
Yeah. I think that the differences between labels and words that we use to articulate our identities are that labels are often something that other people will assign to us as opposed to asking which words we use to describe who we are. So a lot of that is based on assumptions that are based on appearance, that are based on kind of ingrained societal gender roles and appearances.
Right.
So there isn't anything wrong with labels in and of themselves. It's the way that people will apply them to other people without their consent or knowledge.
Right. Go ahead, yeah.
I think it really, for labels, they can be harmful because just in shaping your own identity, if you, example, my situation, where I came out and stated, like, I'm gay because of my same-sex attraction and the relationship I had at the time, there was other things associated with me, like, oh, you're into, like, RuPaul's Drag Race, you're into, like, this, you're...
Just assumptions.
Yeah, and
Right.
like people start to create a perspective of you that doesn't really sit true to who you are, but create it based off of like that label. Oh, you're gay, so that means this, and it just really boxes you in.
And I find labels, they can be helpful, but they can also be problematic and detrimental. So where times when labels can be helpful is when, as Iris said, it does articulate our experience and our identity, and when it acknowledges who we are. So when we have the agency to explain to people what our identity is, that's when it can be a positive, empowering thing. However, people can also make assumptions and project their ideas onto us and label us in ways that we don't agree with. That's when it can be problematic.
Okay.
Can I just go back to a thing
Yeah.
you said earlier about people being worried about offending other people? I think that that's good that they're worried about offending, but I think that they should be more concerned about just respecting people. And I mean, I'm not going to be offended if someone gets it wrong once. I mean, I just would like to see that they take my correction and they, continue to behave as like I would want them to.
Right.
So if your main concern is offending someone, I think that the main concern should be like
Respect.
disrespecting. Yes.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
It's like someone who won't remember your name for some reason and keeps calling you some other and that does happen. They'll just find some other generic cultural name that they think you are.
Right,
I mean, I
right.
feel like that's kind of intersection with racism.
Yeah, no, well, let's talk about that because you all identify with this community, but you're also POCs, people of color. What, I guess, disadvantage in your respective communities do you find having both those, roles or being in both of those communities, as opposed to somebody who isn't a person of color? Are there challenges that you face that somebody who's white, for example, wouldn't face? Yasmin.
Well, I think as a person of color, there's a lot. There's a lot of challenges that there is, but in terms of my role as an educator, I have that privilege, right? Not every white person might also have that privilege. So I have the opportunity to represent part of my community for the people, a lot of trans women of color who probably wouldn't get the voice to speak. So I'm in a real position where I can stand up and be that sort of role model.
Oh yeah, it's so my background, I'm West Indian, but so Trinidad, Tobago, but definitely something that's not openly talked about, in especially the Caribbean. When you were comparing my experience as a person of color versus my peers who have very accepting, like liberal, white gay families, my experience has been like a lot harsher than theirs. I'm still not open to like most of my family, as where you look at, I can think about like all my gay white friends is just like, oh, like, they have those experiences where they bring their boyfriends home. They can be open about themselves, as where I've always kind of kept that hidden. It's kind of just something we don't talk about.
Bisexuality is something you haven't really opened up about.
Yeah, I've kind of kept that secret from my parents. If they see this, then surprise.
Oh, so they don't know if they were to watch this as the first time.
We don't openly talk about it.
Right.
I've literally, when I came out to them, I was just like straight up, I'm gay. At the time, like maybe 2-3 years ago, but I haven't like openly been like, I'm like open to more than just that, because I don't want that pressure to for me to fit a heteronormative lifestyle.
Kylie, I want to bring this up with you because this was, I mean, being two-spirited was something that was really, you know, welcome and celebrated in your community. Then after, you know, colonialism and that kind of thing, things changed a little bit. What is it like now to be somebody who's Indigenous in the LGBTQ2S community?
Well, it's a very interesting experience, and it depends on where I am, depending on the community and depending on the space. Like, for example, as I mentioned to you before, like, you know, prior to colonial contact and religious imperialism and assimilation, Indigenous, LGBTQ, trans, two-spirit people were respected and revered. And then after contact and after colonization, that really changed, like, the attitude and the worldview of our communities. And in my experience, I find growing up in my reserve, Six Nations, it was a very difficult time because it was and still is more heavily entrenched in homophobia and transphobia, but things are changing. So growing up there was a tougher time, but in the past few years, I've been seeing much more awareness, much more understanding, and much more acceptance. But living in downtown Toronto, it is a different experience. There's more acceptance, there's more a willingness for people to embrace and understand who you are. But even within downtown Toronto, in the LGBTQ community, in like the Church Wellesley Village, you know, before I transitioned and started living as female, I was identifying as a gay male. And I found I kind of belonged there more, although there was some, like, you know, racial experiences I had that made it kind of a bit of a struggle. But then after I transitioned and became a trans woman and started living as a woman, I kind of feel like I don't...
Did it get easier?
Well, in a sense, I kind of feel like I don't really belong because I feel like the gay village is really for gays, like white, gay, cisgender males. And I know that's not the case, but sometimes that's how I feel. You know, there are definitely more spaces for cisgender gay males in the village than there is for trans women and specifically people of color.
You were saying Woody's is this place downtown that when you think of the gay village, it's the place to think of, right? Woody's. I've been there. Anyway, but you were saying to me that, you know, when you go in there, it's almost an intimidating feel. Like it is white, gay men.
Yeah.
And non-inclusive.
A very different energy compared to, say, something like, you know, I'll also go to like this queer dance event called Yes Yes Y'all, and and it's very diverse, like very mixed, like white, Asian, straight, like anything one you could think of, like they're in that mix of people. It's so diverse. And yeah, there's no one group is like dominating that space, and it's very welcoming. Everyone's just very open to talking to anyone, dancing with anyone. As we're like, say, in a space like Woody's, there's almost like feels like this weird barrier.
I'm curious, Yasmin. Is this and we've had this discussion before, but is this more in terms of what people are attracted to, or does discrimination exist within the LGBTQS community?
Sure, absolutely. Discrimination, you know, we know is across the board. And in the LGBT community, often people think as specifically for trans people that we're one big happy family. And I'm sure Kylie can talk to this. It's clearly we're not. And for a lot of trans people, I've been talking for so long, and trans women of color, that actually it's a trans woman of color who started Pride. And like Marsha P. Johnson created the Stonewall Riot and all that stuff.
Yeah, going off of what Yasmin said, I think it's kind of interesting and funny in a sad way that trans people are added as an addendum at the end of the LGBTQ acronym. So are Two-Spirit people, when, in my opinion, Two-Spirit Indigenous people were the people who originally inhabited this land, and we are often forgotten and tacked on as an afterthought or an addendum. Same thing with trans people. In my opinion, and you know, spending time and sharing space with a lot of Two-Spirit transgender people, is that we believe there's a common feeling that we should be centered more. And Pride is very much a very corporate gay male thing. When you think of it, as Yasmin said, the roots of it were started by Indigenous people and transgender people of color. So
Yeah.
Go ahead, and then I want to...
There's 2 points worth mentioning, which is I think like also how mainstream media shaped, like example places like Toronto Village, Gay Village, and other cities around the world. It's just like when you look at the representation as like the mainstream media is becoming more accepting of like gay culture. The people in the spotlight were usually white gay males, like Neil Patrick Harris, his husband, people like that in Hollywood, just as the front of like legalization of gay marriage is like the #1 issue in the community.
Right.
But it was really only covering like problems for white gay males. And then once that happened, it feels like issues regarding, trans people, non-binary people just kind of sunk down and were forgotten about. And I think that's why it's important to bring up things like the Black Lives Matter movement. They stopped the Pride Parade that one year. And, as a result of that, we saw more culture in the Pride events.
Yeah. I want to pivot the discussion to employment because, we spend most of our day at work, right? Do you find it's difficult being a person of color and being part of the LGBTQS community getting a job? Kylie?
Yes, actually, I'm experiencing that right now. And, something I've noticed is I've been working since I was 14 years old. And I've never had a problem getting a job. Jobs have always come easy to me, and I've always, hung on to employment. And it's never been a problem. But in the past few years that I've transitioned and started living as a trans woman and living as a woman, it's suddenly become very hard to find a job and very hard to keep a job. I've been let go for very vague reasons that I believe, that I feel were discriminatory. I think if you have a job working at an LGBTQ organization or anywhere within the village, it might be easier and more accepting for trans people, people of color to hold jobs, but outside of that space, in a regular non-trans specific, non-LGBTQ specific organization or company, it would be harder to get a job and maintain a job there.
What's it like to be a model, Iris, and to be non-binary?
My experience has been that people misgender me a lot, even though I feel like I make it quite clear that my pronouns are they and them, and that I don't identify as exclusively male or exclusively female all of the time. And I did this one show that had a theme of multiculturalism, and the whole point was to celebrate diversity. And so I sent them an email before saying, hey, just to let you know, I'm non-binary, so please keep that in mind when you are planning the show. And then they wanted to do a pre-show photo shoot, and then they sent out an email saying, there's a dress code, men should dress this way, women should dress that way. And so I sent them an email again saying, which one do I pick? Because I thought I told you about this before, but, and then they just said, oh, pick whatever one you want. And ideally, I think they should have given a list of clothing items that people could have chosen from, and then
It doesn't say male or
yes,
female.
it doesn't. Yeah, it just says
here.
here are the clothes. Please try to wear denim and a white shirt, and then everyone could do that. And it's not really necessary to gender it.
Yasmin, I want to turn it over to you because violence. That violence and stigma. Women or trans women face that, I think, more than anyone,
Yes.
and trans women of color probably face that even more. Talk to me a bit about that.
So the rates of violence against trans women of color are very high. I think we talked about this a couple of days ago, like in the US. We have a day in November 18, it's called Trans Day of Remembrance. So every year when we look at the stats, the numbers are very high. So like in the US, we have like over 200 trans women of color being murdered, killed for whatever reason. And often we try to think about where's the violence coming from, why is it coming, and why is it targeted to trans women of color specifically? And based on what we know in terms of historically context around racism and how trans people have seen, and then adding that other part to it around color, we feel like it's almost a sense that they feel like trans women of color are intimidating. Or they're disposable. Either they're too strong and they're,
Or they're not people.
Or they're not people.
Right.
And most of the time, it's often people's fear that drives the violence.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And do you have anything to add, Kylie, in terms of stigma?
Yes, I do feel, I feel like as a transgender, two-spirit, Indigenous woman of color, that it's a little, as Yasmin said, like there are higher rates of violence and we are more susceptible to violence. And, just being an Indigenous woman in itself, there's the whole understanding now that, there are missing and murdered Indigenous women. My cousin was one of them, and it's a sad, hard reality. So being a woman, being Indigenous, and being transgender, I feel like there's this, triple risk in a sense. So it's, I've become much more cautious and much more aware with how I move through the world. But I do feel it's probably an easier time if you, again, are like a gay, white, cisgender male. And I find I have also witnessed violence. I've been, a victim of violence, but I experience it most online. Like there's a lot of online harassment that happens, whether it's on Facebook or online dating sites or these dating apps. There's something about being online that gives trolls the courage to be hateful, but that's where I experience it most.
Part of this show is about uncomfortable discussions, and I'm willing to, whoever wants to talk about this, I know you're pretty open to this next subject, and I know you are as well. But I want to understand what it's like to date for you guys, right? And specifically, I mean, who are you attracted to? So, Iris, if I could start with you, do you exclusively date people who are non-binary? How does that work?
I don't really have a label for like my sexual orientation, I suppose. I mean, I have a bunch of different labels,
Right.
so I just say that I will date people if I like them as people without, I don't really see, I'm not going to choose not to date someone because of their gender.
To add on to that, it's just kind of like if you're someone who's open and you're putting yourself in the world, you'll kind of just feel that natural pull to like someone who just feels right. And if there's someone who just goes against like who you are, you're naturally not gonna find yourself with them,
Yasmin, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't have a problem. I'm fabulous. Girl, I step out. I've seen real challenges with dating and trans women in particular, and specifically, I think it's people it's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of what people would think. It's all these different build up to it. And if we just be a little bit more relaxed and be like, this is what I like, and I'm gonna go for it. But really and truly, I see a lot of trans women, specifically of color. And we have to go back to talking about passing, right? Mm-hmm. So when there's this hierarchy around trans people and trans women of color who want to pass as what the media or what the norm is. Right. So you need to look like X, Y, Z to fit into, the box. And that's more where the challenge comes from.
Very much like what Joel said. So as I mentioned earlier, before I transitioned, I did date and have relationships as a gay male. And on Grindr, when I used to use Grindr, the app, and I found a lot of people, you would see blatant racism and discrimination,
And
where
no
people,
rice, no spice.
yes,
I've heard of that.
they'll say, white people only, or no blacks, awful things.
People will say no blacks,
yes,
whites
people,
only.
no Asians, no blacks, whites
Right.
only, no
Yeah.
elders, no fatties, which is so problematic. It's so problematic, but it happens, and I find that kind of that sort of filtering actually happens with face-to-face interactions in bars and things. But now, interestingly, as a trans woman, I find. Well, I am in a long-term relationship with a cisgender straight male, and that's what I'm attracted to. I'm attracted to cisgender men. But I find, and again, online, there's almost like this underbelly or this underground of men who are trans attracted, who are attracted to transgender women. And it's, it can be very problematic and an awful experience because I am fetishized.
I think we are evolving through having conversations like this. I want to thank all of you so much for being so open, so candid, facing these difficult questions that I've posed to you. I really appreciate it, and thank you for watching Living in Color. Thank you for watching Living in Color. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our channel. And if you have an idea for a future Living in Color episode, we'd love your thoughts. Leave them in our comment section.